So this event is part of a series which was set up by the Royal Anthropological Institute's Committee on the Anthropology of Policy and Practice, which Rich and I hope others here sit on. And we created this series, which is called Anthropology Communicates, because we were interested in getting anthropologists from different parts of society, or academic anthropologists who've worked elsewhere outside the academy, to talk about the challenge of how you act and communicate about anthropology in different ways, depending on the political imperatives, your audience, and so forth. What we would really love, I suppose, both as a committee and in this series, is to enhance the profile and the influence of anthropology. I mean, what better way, actually, than having anthropologists in parliaments? So I'm particularly delighted in this event today to welcome two very, very special guests, Harini Amarasuriya and Heidi Swank, who we'll introduce properly in a moment, who are or have been politicians, but are also trained anthropologists. And so we want to get into a discussion with them today, but I'd also like to welcome Jonathan Spencer from the University of Edinburgh, who was also my PhD examiner. So I'm still in a kind of respectful mode, even though it was about 100 years ago. Welcome to everyone. And I'll explain a bit more about how we'll get into a discussion later. But let's hear from our guests first. So I'm going to ask Jonathan if you wouldn't mind introducing Harini, and then I'm going to ask Rich to do the same, and then we'll hear from them.
Thank you, Emma. It was only about 60 years rather than 100 years, but apart from that, everything is true. Quite a long time ago, maybe 15 or so years ago, my daughter, who is a keen observer of humanity, every time I reported on a meeting with our guest Harini, she would turn to me and she'd say, "Have they made her prime minister yet?" Which showed extraordinary prescience, because at that point Harini was a PhD student with no discernible political ambitions whatsoever, but nevertheless some kind of aura of political greatness already attached itself to her. She did a PhD with us in Edinburgh, finishing in 2010, which is basically an ethnography of a government agency, a child protection agency back in Sri Lanka. She returned to Sri Lanka, where she took up a position at the Open University there, and very quickly got caught up in a rather extraordinary episode, which was a national strike by the academic trade union, which she was quite centrally involved, along with a number of other extremely bright and interesting people. That strike pushed her, I think, into the political arena, possibly slightly unwillingly. And in the years that followed, Harini little by little began to find herself on public platforms of one sort or another, talking to various progressive causes. In 2019, when there was a parliamentary election in Sri Lanka, she was nominated on the national list of candidates for a coalition called the National People's Power Coalition, an alliance of progressive groups of one sort or another. I won't explain the nuances of the Sri Lankan proportional representation system, except to say that when the dust settled from the election, there was one seat available, and Harini was persuaded, I think, despite some reluctance on her part, to accept the seat. One of the pull factors, I think, in her accepting the seat was the historical problem of gender underrepresentation in the Sri Lankan parliament, which out of 200 plus members still has only about a dozen women members. So one reason for pushing her out of the available candidates was that she was a prominent female academic and much respected for that. And I think one of the reasons why she had her arm, allowed her arm to be twisted as hard as it was twisted, was this need to redress the gender imbalance in the parliament. So she is a genuinely reluctant politician, and she wouldn't have accepted the label politician. In fact, she probably won't accept it now, but she's learning to live with it. And her account of what it's been like to be an anthropologist amongst the politicians is going to be extremely interesting. So that is my introduction.
Thank you. Brilliant. Rich, would you very kindly introduce Heidi?
Dr. Heidi Swank is also an anthropologist amongst politicians. I'm going to introduce her first as a politician. Heidi was formerly a member of the Nevada Assembly, the state assembly in Nevada, where she served 4 terms representing the central part of Las Vegas, including the famed Las Vegas Strip. While in office, Heidi chaired a number of regular session committees, including the Committee on Natural Resources, Agriculture and Mining, and the General Governance Subcommittee of Ways and Means. She also chaired several interim committees, session committees, including the Public Lands Committee and the Committee on Wildfires, and she was the Assistant Majority Whip for 2 sessions. As an anthropologist, Heidi has done research on everyday literacy amongst Tibetan refugees in Dharamshala, India. And it was there that I met Heidi. We were both PhD students. I was doing my research in the neighbouring district of Chamba on migratory shepherds, and Heidi, as I said, was looking at literacy and the use of the everyday literacies amongst the Tibetan population in a very small town called McLeod, which is of course the home of the Dalai Lama. And I think we met in a cafe first of all, and I was absolutely, I have to confess, Heidi, I've probably never told you, it's absolutely in awe of your commitment and the rigour, the way you went about your field work. When we met, I think you were sharing a small room with 3 generations of one family. But as you know, as I got to know you, I remember you chasing people down the street in order to get a shopping list. You needed a copy of the shopping list they'd handed over, which was, you know, central to your work, and text messages, copying those, or how, you know, how people would address an envelope. Very, really simple things, but just incredible commitment. And you made me feel quite amateurish in that. You also made me feel quite amateurish in your commitment to making the perfect martini. And I think it probably was a central part of getting me through my field work in Chamba, was being able to come and see you and sort of drinking martini on the balcony of your lovely apartment in McLeod. Heidi received a doctorate from Northwestern University in 2006. She was assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas, and her monograph, Rewriting Shangri-La, Tibetan Youth Migration and Literacies in McLeod, was published in 2014. Heidi left Las Vegas last year. I think in the middle of winter, you had a sort of road trip across the states to Minnesota, where she's now the executive director of REFOS, Places Reimagined, a historic preservation nonprofit that works in 5 US states and is expanding across the country. Heidi is also, I should mention, the founder of the Flamingo Drinking Club. And I'm sure we're going to hear more about that if we can. I don't know what the rules of the Flamingo Drinking Club are and if you can talk about it, but we may hear more.
Fabulous. Thank you very, very much. Okay, so we now know who our guests are. Let's hear from them. So over to you, Harini. Tell us what it's like to be an anthropologist in Parliament, please.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you, RAI, for organizing this and putting this event together. It's really nice to be with a group of anthropologists after a long time, and also to have this opportunity to sort of reflect on my past. Well, I've been in Parliament now for about 14 months. So this is something very new to me. And so I really appreciate this opportunity I've got today to kind of reflect on the past 14 months or so. So like Jonathan said, I never intended to get into politics. I had no intentions whatsoever of being sort of involved in any kind of electoral politics or even party politics. But my involvement, as Jonathan mentioned also, in the trade union activity of the university academics in Sri Lanka in 2010 2011 and 2012 meant that many of us, many Sri Lankan academics, kind of got involved in the political landscape in ways in which we had never intended to. This is also a time of quite a lot of political turmoil in Sri Lanka. And several of us who were part of that trade union movement at various points between 2012 and 2015 decided to engage in actively campaigning for political change in Sri Lanka and aligning ourselves with a particular political party, the People's Liberation Front, or the Janata Vimukti Peramuna at that time. The JVP also then called upon us at various points to help them draft policy statements on various issues, education, agriculture, economics, and many of us sat on those policy drafting committees for the JVP at that time. And in that process, there was this sort of idea that we needed a platform that could bring together progressive, left-leaning academics, professionals, artists, and other political parties onto sort of a common platform where, especially for people who didn't want to necessarily identify themselves with the JVP explicitly for many reasons, including the fact that many of us had a very difficult relationship with the JVP, particularly in the 80s. Many of us were now working with them, were on opposite sides of the political spectrum in the 1980s. So that was how this idea of forming this larger coalition, which included the JVP as the main political party, but to broaden this platform to include other sort of progressive left organizations, political parties, and also individuals. This idea came about, and somewhere in 2018, we decided to form this alliance called the National People's Power. I was quite involved in the formation of the NPP in that I became part of the NPP's executive committee at the time. And soon after we formed the NPP, the presidential elections were announced, and also general elections were called in 2019, and then a few months later in 2020. So NPP then decided to put forward a candidate for the presidential election, and many of us again campaigned on the NPP platform. And then when the general election came around, when we were drawing out, we again decided that we would contest the general election as the NPP. So in drawing up the election, the nomination lists for the general election, I was asked whether I would agree to having my name put on their list of nominees for the national list. The national list there are 25 seats in the parliament. The parliament consists of 225 seats. 25 seats are reserved for nominated members. And based on the number of votes each party gets at the general election, a number of national list seats are allocated to each party that is in parliament. But at the time of campaigning, each party has to actually submit 25 names, potential names of those who might fill the national list seats. So NPP also had to come up with 25 names, and we were scrabbling to find names. And I was also within the party, there was this concern that we needed to make sure that women were on election list as well as in national list nominations. And then they asked me whether I would consent to have my name on the national list, to which I agreed, because in my thinking, I was one name among 25. I was quite sure that the NPP was not going to get many national list positions at the election, and I was pretty sure that I would not have to do anything beyond consenting to having my name on the list. The elections took place in 2020, and the National People's Power obtained only 3 seats, two from direct election and one from the national list. And then I was asked whether I would consent to be the national list nominee of the NPP. And I was basically given about 48 hours to make up my mind. And because the names had to be submitted to the elections commissioner within a week. My first response was a resounding no. There was no way that it involved quitting my job at the time where I was teaching at the Open University and embarking on a career that I had no expectations of ever being part of. So my initial reaction was a resounding no, but somehow this news that I had been nominated by the NPP was leaked to the media, and it became quite a topic of discussion, particularly the fact that a woman had been nominated to the single national list seat that the NPP got, and also that the nomination came from outside of the main political party in the alliance, the JVP, that the JVP had consented to a non-JVP person being nominated. So this created quite a lot of discussion, particularly in the media, and this, along with what Jonathan also mentioned, the fact that the NPP had campaigned for a higher percentage of women's representation in parliament, and I felt that it became a situation where it felt really impossible for me to say no. So I agreed, and 2 weeks after that, I was in the national parliament. So to say I was unprepared is an understatement. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. And I think Heidi also said this in a conversation that we had on email before this event. I kind of thought about this as doing field work. I thought, okay, I'm doing field work, right? I'm doing field work in the parliament. That's how I'm going to approach this. And I even had like my notebook with me, which I would take to parliament every day. And at the end of the day, I would write up my notes about my observations. I actually set about it very much as I did field work before, because I could not see what other role I was actually going to play in the parliament. We were 3 people. We were a minority in the opposition. The government at the time, or even now, the government had won a resounding victory. They had 2/3 control. They had the majority, 2/3 control over the parliament. So the opposition was anyway in a very weak position. And so with such a dominant government in power, I basically thought that, this is going to be 2-3 years of me sort of gently getting used to this whole process and kind of entering into this new space, and that I would spend lots of time in the parliament library, and that I could, just use this as a time for getting an insider perspective into how government works. Very soon after entering parliament, COVID struck and we went into shutdown. Things also started going quite badly in Sri Lanka, both in sort of economic terms and in terms of managing COVID. The government very rapidly became quite unpopular. So much to my shock, it was not a sort of a easing into this new position. Very soon, even though we were a small party of 3, we were called upon to do quite a bit of work, both inside and outside parliament. One of the biggest, I think, challenges for me was also I was trained as an anthropologist. I had a real antipathy to statistics and to economics. I mean, my choices in my academic life were very much influenced by my dislike of statistics. And here I was in Parliament, having to deal with finance bills, tax bills, and I was also nominated to the Committee on Public Accounts, right, which was responsible for auditing government ministries and departments. So I had to go through sort of, you know, reams of numbers and figures and audit reports from the government audit on various projects and departments of the government. And most of the debates, also much to my horror, and I mean, now looking back on it, I'm thinking I was so naive about all of this. I realized that most of what you debate in Parliament revolves around finance and economics, because primary responsibility of the Parliament is financial oversight. So it was sort of having to suddenly start understanding economics, understanding how accounts are presented, how they're debated, what numbers mean, having to deal with the government auditors. So it was a pretty huge, steep learning curve for me. So that was one side of it. And the other aspect was, I think, and this is probably where my anthropology training came in useful, is that, and also the fact that I approached it very much like I was doing field work, I simply felt that I needed to talk to anybody and everybody, and that sort of, you know, whether it was Parliament staff, members of other parties, you know, like how you would do interviews in field work, I would just sort of talk to everybody. And I think that really helped me also in kind of feeling my way around that whole space physically and also sort of, you know, mentally for me. The fact that the political situation in Sri Lanka is so volatile has also meant that I've had to deal with being in the public eye much more than I imagined. And again, I think I was completely naive about this. I had no idea that being a parliamentarian meant that you were under so much public scrutiny. And from the very beginning, I was sort of very conscious that I didn't want any part of my life to change. And I'm finding that increasingly difficult, right? My life has changed. And I think it took me till a few months ago, a couple of months ago, for that to really sink in, that I am not, you know, I cannot go back to the life that I had 14 months ago or 15 months ago, right? And that even a simple thing like going to the supermarket or going to a restaurant is something that I need to do more consciously now. So that having to deal with sort of that public attention and that public scrutiny has been incredibly difficult. And I think that transition from being an academic to this more public role has been incredibly difficult. Also, the fact, I think that, you know, as an academic, you're trained to be analytical, you're trained to be independent, you're trained to be able to sort of trained to say things based on your sort of analysis, your theoretical reasoning, right? But in politics, I can't say exactly what I think all the time. I can't. I need to be aware of the party position on things. I also learned really fast that whatever I said, it didn't matter whether I said something that I felt was a personal opinion or something that was based on my own observations that was immediately then perceived publicly as having political significance, right? So having to be much more careful about what I said, knowing that I'm no longer independent. My views are no longer regarded as the same way as my views were when I was speaking publicly, even as an academic. So that transition, I think, has been, and that realization of that being the difference between being a public intellectual and being a politician, I think is something that is just only now beginning to sink in. And I'm not sure whether this is something that I will continue to do. Certainly one lesson that I have learned is that I have very little control over what happens, right? And again, very much like field work, you sort of take each day as it comes, and you sort of, go with the flow. And I think that anthropological training of accepting situations and sort of, learning to let go of your desire to control everything around you, I think has been incredibly helpful in some ways in this new thing that I've had to do rather unexpectedly. So I'll end there, Emma, I think, and maybe we can discuss this more during the Q&A time.
Thank you so much, Harini. Yes, please. I hope everyone is thinking up questions or comments or whatever. I mean, I really look forward to thinking more about the nature of the work of politicians. I was really interested in you raising this business of how research, although you were slightly joking about how you were doing fieldwork, but actually surely research is a big part of being a politician. So I'm really interested in exploring more about the nature of that task, what kind of research is needed. But I'm also interested in everything you said about the way that you relate to the world differently. So I'm really looking forward to all that. But I am going to give Heidi a chance now before we get into all those issues. So let's hear from Heidi.
Thanks, Emma. And it was really interesting listening to Harini because I'm nodding. I'm like, yep, uh-huh. There's I think a lot of commonalities there in the ways in which we both feel about being in elected office. I'll kind of start out a little bit about how I ended up in office. As Rich said, I represented the district in Nevada that includes the Las Vegas Strip and then the historic neighborhoods around it. So in some ways, it was a really interesting district to represent. It was a rather large urban district because it's determined by population, and so many people don't live in that huge swath of the Las Vegas Strip. So it looks like a very large part of Las Vegas. That was my assembly district. So I ended up in Las Vegas. I got hired as an assistant professor at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. I worked there for about 7 years, right on the cusp of getting tenured when the Great Recession hit. And in Nevada, Nevada was particularly hard hit during the recession, in part because so much of the state budget is determined by tourism. And so I think the number is there were about 300 faculty at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas who lost their jobs during the recession. And just to give you an idea of like the impact of the Great Recession in Las Vegas, my husband and I bought our home for $280,000 US in 2005. At the bottom of the recession, it was worth $80,000. And this was common. This was the reality of the Great Recession in Las Vegas. It was, you could get a house for $30,000. I'd say that maybe about 3 years ago, now our house in Las Vegas is no longer underwater. So it was a very different experience in Las Vegas than in most places for the Great Recession. So it wasn't unusual. There was a period in the Great Recession when my husband and I were both out of work without health insurance and just kind of crossing our fingers to see if we could make it through. So it was in that whole arena that I had lost my job, and I had, as Rich said, I had started this group in my first years in Las Vegas called the Flamingo Club. It was a traveling cocktail party, I will admit, and it met at a different house in the Las Vegas historic neighborhoods once a month, and neighbors just got together, and it was something that people really wanted and really needed, and it grew really fast. So it went from just like 10 of us meeting to 200 people on the mailing list, with like 50 people showing up every month. And you just show up when you wanted to. So of course, politicians showed up because they had a whole bunch of their constituents coming together, and it was a great way for them to network. And so I got to know a bunch of these politicians. And so when I lost my job during the recession, they approached me at it was the October party. I remember that October party, and at my house, and they approached me about running because there was an open seat due to redistricting. Every 10 years, the US redistricts all of the political districts in the country. And so this was an empty seat, and I didn't have anything else I was doing. There weren't really any jobs that were hiring in academia at the time. And so there weren't a lot of good options for me. And so I kind of just took this and thought, okay, this would be a way to kind of restart. I need to find another path, and this seemed like it had presented itself. So I was elected in November of 2012 in a really heavily Democrat district. So it's a district that's considered safe. Republicans don't run against, no serious Republican candidates will run against that in that district. And it might be that you'd have a primary. But I could talk about this later a little bit about how the role of like caucuses in the United States and selecting who actually gets to win the primary. But I only had so I served 4 terms, so it's 4 election cycles. 2 of those were unopposed, and one of them the first one had an actual kind of credible candidate, but the third one did not have any credible candidate. So it was really an easy walk for me to get into office because the politicians who recruited me paved the way. They made sure everyone knew I was the person that they were putting up for this. And so it made it much easier. So when I got first elected in 2013, I had to go up to Carson City, which is an 8-hour drive from Las Vegas at the other end of the state near Reno, Nevada. I had never been to Carson City. I didn't know where Carson City was. I put it in my phone and I drove. And so it was very, as like Harini said, I was very underprepared for this. And when I got there, I found the whole process to be extremely fascinating as an anthropologist, because I thought, and I just treated it like Harini said, like a fieldwork site. Because I was there and I was approached by all of these people who wanted to help me. And I knew that those were not the people I should listen to. That first person who approaches you in the field may not be the best resource for you. And so I spent much of my first session really pretty quiet. I remember the majority leader at the end of session commented on how the first half of the legislative session, Heidi said nothing, and then she didn't stop talking. Because I just spent a lot of time trying to figure out who was who and who did what. And like, I didn't really quite know like what my relationship to a lobbyist should be. I didn't quite know what my relationship to Republicans should be. So in Nevada, in the assembly, it had been a Democrat majority for like 30 years. And so I kind of came in with the idea that, oh, I don't even need to pay attention to the Republicans. That doesn't matter. They're in the minority. And then I learned that actually a lot of the issues that I'm interested in are the same ones that Republicans are interested in. Issues around what do we do with our public lands? So in Nevada, 86% of the state is owned by the federal government. And that means we intersect with the federal government quite a bit. And most of those areas are Republican majority areas. And so I found that I spent a lot more time with Republicans on issues and working on issues than I actually did with Democrats. And out of that came a lot more friendships with Republicans. But I'd say that it was just, I'm trying to think of like the ways in which it was the most interesting, I think, is that like I came to really value those relationships with the Republicans. And to this day, now that I left office in 2020, just as the pandemic was really bearing down on the United States, and those are still the people that I'm more in touch with now, are the folks on the other side of the aisle for me. And I think in many ways, because those relationships were much harder to build. You could presume that you had commonalities with the people of your own party, but you couldn't presume that. And given that I really anchored the left end of things in the Nevada Assembly for a good while, it was kind of surprising to me that I would end up being such good friends with a lot of the Republicans and finding much more common ground. And I will say too, that was one of the more interesting things about being elected in Nevada, where I grew up in the Midwest, in Wisconsin, in the Minneapolis area where I live now. And when I came to Nevada, like it was amazing to me that there were members of of my caucus of the Democrats who were also members of the National Rifle Association. That was a revelation to me, because coming from the Midwest, those didn't cross. And so finding these ways in which you are a Democrat that doesn't have the attributes that I thought they would have, and finding that still meant that you were a Democrat. To me, if you were a National Rifle Association member, you were not a Democrat. And so finding that way that Nevada like really kind of configures what a Democrat is was very interesting, because it meant that there were a lot of ways in which I just could not intersect with the interests of my own party. And especially being somebody who was so far left. I'm here in the Minneapolis area now, and I'm a moderate Democrat. Out there, I'm a definite far left. I had a conversation with one of my Republican friends a couple of months ago. He called about something, and I said, Greg, you know what? I'm a moderate Democrat in Minnesota, and he's like, no way. And it because it just seemed in Nevada unbelievable. I want to go back to also something that Harini talked about, which is like the gender issues. There were some really interesting things that were happening in Nevada in the time in which I was in the legislature. So one of the things when I got to the Nevada legislature that I found really interesting is that there were a lot of there wasn't like a gender disparity in like people getting elected to office as much, but the ways in which women were treated in the legislature was really fascinating to me, because I kind of felt I was back in like the 80s. I also learned that women were not in the Nevada legislature allowed to wear pants until the early 1990s. So, but like, just the simple things of like trying to get on an elevator became like this battle of gender wills, because I remember like going up to an elevator, a bunch of male lobbyists standing at the ahead, and I came around the back, elevator opens up, and it just like the sea parted, and they would not get on the elevator until I did. And so I just stood there. I'm like, I'm not getting on the elevator. I got here last, just get on. The number of times that I wasn't allowed to carry my bags, it became kind of a joke that Heidi did not want you opening a door for her. And so, because there were just these ways in which these gender roles that I had thought we had so left behind in my liberal bubble in the middle of Las Vegas really came back in play in the legislature. And so that kind of carried like through the entire legislature. And it actually, now looking back on all of this, is really interesting for what happened in like the 2019 legislative session, which was my last legislative session. In Nevada, we only meet every other year for 4 months. So it's a really very part-time gig. And so in 2019, the Nevada legislature was the first female majority legislature in the history of the United States. And I was one of those women that made it a majority. And so the New York Times showed up. They had a full, spread on the front page with all of us. We had reporters following us around for several days. And given my kind of gender experiences, that was very interesting. But then it also meant that there were several things that happened during that legislative session that that was really quite remarkable to be part of. So the leadership was male in both houses, but they started among the Democrats ousting sexual harassers. And there were 3 men who were forced out of office, one who had been there for about 30 years, and various roles, and he was censured and forced to resign. And then there were 2 gentlemen, one who was elected to national office. His name is Reuben Kewen, and he was a representative from Nevada. He was actually my representative. And he was forced out of office at the federal level, at the national level, for the sexual harassment he had done in Nevada, as well as in DC. And then he came back to Las Vegas with the idea that he was going to run for city council immediately. And this was part of the whole Me Too movement, with everyone really re-examining gender roles. And he would have been my city councilman. And I could not have this happen in my own district, when there were so many other candidates who were just as well qualified, but had not sexually harassed someone. So I started a 501c4 called No Means No Reuben, and we hired folks and we fundraised around keeping him out of office, and we ran an anti-campaign that kept him out of the Las Vegas City Council. And he never made it out of the primary. And so we ended up with a lovely woman in office who does a really good job in city council. But it really seemed like in that period in Nevada, there was this whole reckoning around gender and sexual harassment that I hope is continuing today. And there was also another gentleman named Mike Sprinkle, who had been a serial sexual harasser in the assembly. And he had sexually harassed me, and I had not said anything about it because I needed to kind of figure out like what the best path was. And then I reported it in 2019, and the leadership took it and ran with it. And within a week he was out, because once there was one report, there was a whole multitude of reports that came out. So it was a really interesting time to see the ways in which from 2013 to 2020, the ways in which gender were dealt with, and the ways in which people really, I would say the Democratic leadership was amazing. They really picked it up, and they stepped in for their female colleagues, and a lot of women stepped up too. But it really made that whole trajectory to be very interesting. I could go on for so many other things, but there's a lot of things that are really interesting about the ways in which people get selected to even run for office. There are, ways in which, because Nevada is such a part-time legislature, that there are people who are kind of dynasty candidates whose families have always run, who always end up in office. And then there are other folks, like we have one gentleman who is in the assembly with me, named William McCurdy, single parent, hadn't finished high school, hadn't finished college, got elected, now has his BA, and he sits on the Clark County Commission, which is a full-time body, local, and probably the most powerful body, elected body in the state. And so there are those those stories where people really kind of jump out of that trajectory that they've been put into by birth, and other ones where it's just a reinforcing curve that you just end up in office. And so I think looking at the ways in which people can use this and are using this to like kind of get out of that path that they were put on is really interesting to me. But I'll kind of stop there. I think I'm kind of getting to the jumble of ideas that are just coming out of my mouth. So I'm happy to answer any questions. But I will say in the end, like I left in 2020 because it's a lot to ask people to leave their jobs for 4 months every other year, and to then also have a job that they are running for 18 months and then leave, and to try to keep that going. It's very difficult to maintain that. I got very much burned out at both jobs, which is why I left both and took a new job someplace else, because I needed to find something else because I was totally burned out on both. And it also gets the idea that of representative government in places like Nevada. If you look at anyone who's ever been elected to the Nevada legislature, like in the last 10 years, they are either a school teacher, an entrepreneur, a lawyer whose firm probably pays them to their salary while they're still in office, a union person, or a retired person. Every person I know fits into one of those 5 categories. And that's because there's only certain people who can actually take that much time away from their jobs in order to serve. And so there are a lot of questions I have about how representative government is in the United States that I think are interesting too. So with that, I'll toss it back, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. We'll get to that point soon, Heidi. Thank you very, very much. So many fascinating insights, including many about the relationships that you had with others. I'm dying to ask about constituencies, but before we get into commenting and questioning to everyone, let's see if Jonathan would like to reflect or ask questions or react, just to get our discussion going. And we're going to kind of have a panel now. You may see some of us are spotlighted, so we're a panel. Jonathan, over to you.
Okay, this is seriously seat of the pants stuff, as I had no idea exactly what our 2 speakers were going to focus on and talk about. Although I have been paying quite a lot of attention, an unhealthy amount of attention possibly, to Harani's political career. So much that she was saying was not completely new to me. I guess one thing just to start is to think about 2 questions that we've been slightly zigzagging between, which is the question of being a politician and the question of being somebody in a legislature, because I think obviously there's quite a substantial overlap between the two. There are not many people in legislatures who are not politicians. Nevertheless, there's that stuff when you're going out into the world where you're getting recognized in the supermarket, or when you're shaking hands or opening events or whatever else you've been asked to do, which is rather different from what you're doing in this very specific, constrained, framed and highly artificial world of the legislature. So I just was thinking about that. But I guess one theme, I've only got about 2 or 3 things to say, but the second of the things I want to say, one thing that I was already thinking about before the comments from our 2 speakers was the paradoxes of agency, the fact that both Harani and Heidi, in their accounts of their careers, basically present themselves as kind of reluctant politicians, to put it mildly. And I think, okay, this could be opposed. If it was Boris Johnson saying I was dragged into this position, I don't think anyone would believe that any more than almost anything else he said. But I think in both these cases, I certainly very vividly remember the week or so when Harani was under maximum pressure, partly because a certain amount of the collateral was flying my way in the form of WhatsApp messages amongst her extensive circle of friends. There was no doubt that perhaps unusually, both of our speakers were sort of found themselves in a place they didn't expect to. Nevertheless, I think what they then say about what happens when you arrive and the lack of control over what happens next is almost certainly true of almost anybody else who gets put into that arena. And Harini compared that to fieldwork, and I think that's an obvious, potentially very rich comparison to make here. You know, I think I'll excuse anybody who's still having to sit in anthropology lectures on the receiving end from what I next say, but we're often told that you know, in this world of like power, knowledge, nexuses, and so on, we have the power, and yet I've never felt as powerless in my life as I did when I was doing my doctoral fieldwork. I really didn't have a clue what I was supposed to be doing, and I would try to anticipate situations by performing what I thought people wanted me to do without being, you know, without being able to read the cues or know what the script was or anything. So it was a bit like being pushed out onto the stage of a theatre. It's one of those classic anxiety dream situations. You go into the bathroom, you open the bathroom door to come out, and you find you're actually on the stage of, I don't know, the Royal Opera House or something, and somebody's expecting you to sing. And that sounds, to me, that kind of anxiety dream scenario sounds like what it's like to find yourself in Parliament. And an interesting theme, which Heidi mentioned, I mean, which connects up to the gender thing, and which kind of sounds like a trivial way of thinking about it, is what you wear. And yet for the whole first, I guess, 6 months that Harini was in Parliament, I think I drove her nuts by teasing her endlessly about the new sari she was wearing every week. Harini's not known as a great sari wearer. The sari is an ideologically hypercharged symbol of respectable femininity across South Asia, but certainly in Sri Lanka. And what Heidi says about not being allowed to wear pants. There are vice chancellors in Sri Lankan universities who demand that their female academic staff go to work in sari. So seeing Harini in a sari every day, well, it was amusing to me, but it was clearly less and less amusing to her. And so thankfully, I think I've stopped making those jokes recently. Nevertheless, it seems like a quite powerful metaphor of powerlessness, that you're having to, however much you don't want to do that, you're having to some extent to wear the costume that's expected of you in order to be able to function in this place. And so the theatricality of it all, and this is where the thing about the legislatures sort of comes to mind, the theatricality of it all came home to me through all of these comments, and also thinking about what Harini has been telling me over the 14 months and she's in Parliament. And I sort of wonder, because on the one hand, you're having to perform, you're having to do what's expected of you. And yet it's not that it's completely ineffectual. It's not pure ritual. I mean, this is a sort of rather important anthropological lesson. That use of the word ritual to mean kind of meaningless, like it doesn't do anything, nothing moves, nothing changes, is something we all have to unlearn if we're going to do anything anthropological in a context like this. So the fact is that stuff does happen and things do change, despite, or even possibly because of, the theatricality of the setting in which things are happening. And one thing I'd quite like to do, I mean, would be to arrive in Colombo with a box of copies of Presentation of Self in Everyday Life for Harini to distribute amongst her, which is the great book of the theatrical metaphor, to distribute amongst their parliamentary colleagues, get them all to read it during a recess, and then come back and see what happens, what the self-consciousness about this actually does to the functioning of the parliament. The other thing that I'd just like to think about for a minute, because politicians are vilified and politicians are unpopular, and one reason, among many reasons, for the problems of gender imbalance, certainly in Sri Lankan politics, is the negative connotations of putting yourself into the political arena. And I was thinking, while you were both talking, of Emma's work in the House of Commons when she started her big project there around the time of the expenses scandal, when politicians, were at the time we thought they'd hit rock bottom in terms of public perceptions, but little did we know what was coming next. Nevertheless, I remember Emma saying at that time, when she sort of first reporting back on that work, that basically she ended up feeling quite sorry for them. That it wasn't a particularly nice life being a politician. And the one thing she wanted to do as an ethnographer writing about politicians was, if you like, this is my term, not hers, but was to kind of rehumanize them, to remind us that they are people of various different sorts, which was going very much against the grain of the popular perceptions. So I suppose a question I'd leave for Heidi and Harini is, should we feel sorry for politicians? Is that an appropriate anthropological lesson that you would also wish to endorse when telling about your experiences? So I'll start with that.
Great stuff. So if everybody else, meantime, I'm going to give Heidi and Harini both a chance to respond in a moment. But if anybody else has got questions, or if you want to put things in the chat, or you can put them anonymously to me, then do any of those options. But no, so I want to give you a chance to respond. I'll come to Harini first, but maybe I could just add that is the experience of being a politician sort of a qualitative leap away from being anything else? Or one of the ideas I've been experimenting with is that the difficulties that Jonathan is referring to, and the exposure that you talked about, Harini, and the fact that there's a lot of people watching, a lot at stake. What you do can have a big impact, and obviously in different ways for different politicians. But also, it's so highly competitive, and this is not so true in the House of Lords as in the House of Commons in the UK context. So it's not even in every parliament. But do all these things that you've been talking about, and the kinds of things you can observe in other parliaments, mean that it's not that you're completely different from other people doing other kinds of work, but that it's more, everything gets magnified, a bit like the kind of idea in psychology that actually when people's states become really problematic, it's not that they're completely different from normal states, it's that there's a magnification or an amplification of, you know, distress or whatever until it tips over into something else. And I suppose for me, that's connected with Jonathan's question about how should we react to politicians? Should we feel sorry? How can we identify without losing our critical faculties as well? I'm also playing for time for the audience a little bit to give you a chance to come up with questions, and you know we're interested to hear what you have to say, or comments as well. But Harini, over to you. Do you want to respond at this point?
Sure, Emma. I don't think feeling sorry, that's not how I would quite describe it. But I must say that I've grown to respect politicians far more than I did before, in that I recognize that there's a set of skills that are required to do this properly, right? And I don't think people, maybe non-politicians, quite understand the skills that are required to be an effective politician, right? And I think that was something that struck me, because there's such a negative, I mean, politicians draw so much negativity, and there's such a sort of resistance to politics, and such a sort of, you know, that all politicians are crooks, all politicians are corrupt. And, you know, I mean, in Sri Lanka, there's like, you know, 225 of us, and we are sort of routinely cursed, right? Like, may all 225, you know, die of COVID, or may all 25 be sort of, you know, hit by a bolt of lightning. You know, there's this constant sort of critique of politicians and of the parliament in particular as being a total waste of public money. And I get where that's coming from, right? I get where that's coming from, because politics has become, in a way, so disconnected with the lives of people in some ways. But having gone, having now become part of that whole setup, I also realized that the amount of work that even the most sort of insignificant politician like me in my first year, the demands that are made on you, right? You don't get time off. You at least I don't know what it's like, Heidi, for you, but we meet every month, right, for 8 days every month, and that's just your time in the parliament. And the rest of the time you have to be available for other kinds of work, right? And you don't have time off. You don't get to switch your phone off. You don't get to not answer emails. So that constantly having to be present, right? And I've also come to think that, I don't know whether it's the particular situation in Sri Lanka, that people feel that they can talk to the politician about anything and everything, right? So I've had people requesting me to find them books in the library to dealing with some corruption issue, right? So anything and everything is discussed and brought to your attention, and I guess you have to listen, you have to be available, you have to respond. You can't say, well, that's a really stupid question you're asking, go away. That doesn't work anymore, right? So that I think that pressure to be constantly available and responsive is something that I really I never realized was so sort of time consuming and so demanding. So in that sense, I don't feel sorry. I wouldn't say politicians need sympathy, because they also get away with quite a bit. And I mean, I think the critique of politicians is well, I mean, there's a basis for that, but it does call upon you to put yourself out there in ways that are not necessarily the same in other professions. Yeah, and I think that that it brings with it demands of you a whole different set of skills and ways of sort of dealing with people that many people don't necessarily recognize as also part of what a politician does. So I think that's one thing. And the other thing I just wanted to touch on was also the gender aspect of it. Like, I mean, I could completely relate to what Heidi was saying in whether it was dress. I mean, I'm also one of 12 in a legislature of 225. And that was, for me, a huge, from being in an academic context where it was, 6 women were very much more dominant in that space, to suddenly be in this sort of space where, like you said, I felt I had gone back to the 1970s or the 1980s or something, where, and even the way in which I was addressed, my male colleagues are addressed as Honorable MP, even if some of them who have a PhD are Honorable Doctor. I was always Honorable Dr. Miss, right? They were never called Mr., but I was always called Miss. That I had 3 things. I mean, even, and this, I mean, the fact that I had to actually point this out and fight and say, this is wrong, this is incorrect. Why aren't you saying the same thing for the male colleague? Things that you should, completely take for granted. Or the fact that when I, the toilets for women in the parliament didn't have sanitary disposal bins, and when I was talking about period poverty, and I mentioned this in Parliament, and it caused this huge furor because I actually talked about sanitary pads in Parliament, right? And mentioned the fact that toilets didn't have this sanitary disposing units, right? So things that you wouldn't have, you feel that you in some ways you also feel you've gone back in time when it comes to certain sort of that the ways, especially in relation to gender issues, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Heidi, did you want to come in at this point? And then I'm going to come to Gwen, who's got her hand up.
Yeah, and I think just to echo a few things that Harini said, that I do feel like there's the eternal demand, right? There's always, and I'll agree. I'm not sure that politicians, you should feel sorry for them. But there are a lot of demands on people that you don't quite realize when you get in. And so like in Nevada, where you're in session for 4 months every other year, and when you're out of session, you have no staff. Whenever anyone called, they just called my cell phone number. Was the only way to reach me. And so there was no one there to kind of filter anything for me or to help out on that front. I actually ended up hiring a woman to work a couple hours a week just to help me manage my email and some setting appointments in the interim sessions. And I paid her out of my campaign funds. Just to be able to manage things because there's just no support. But one thing I also wanted to touch on is that I found this a lot, like when I got to the legislature and when other freshmen arrive, is that you have this feeling that I was just elected by, there's 64,000 people in my district and I was elected by those people. And so you've come feeling like I am going to change the world. I am empowered. This is what I've come here to do. And then you step into what is really an extremely vertical hierarchy that you start to realize really quickly that there are people to always be thanked. And that if you do not thank them, your bill will not advance. It may not get funded. And that this is just the way things are. And that because everyone, and it's a way, it gets to be very chaotic. But also I think it's in many ways just, it helps to kind of dampen people's sense of what's possible once they get there. I feel like people come and they think, I'm going to make all these changes, and they're really happy at the end of their first session when they've gotten 2 bills, or they're really upset and they never come back. But I remember like having conversations with like the woman who's in my spot now is, be sure like you don't presume that your bill is going to get a hearing. You need to go and ask for a hearing. Like you need to be sure that, don't try not to bring any bills your first session that have any kind of fiscal impact, because it's really hard for a freshman to get a bill that costs anything in Nevada. And so if you do by some miracle your freshman session get some minuscule funding for something, be very thankful, because you need to, if you can negotiate that vertical hierarchy in your first few sessions, you will then be set up to be in a much better spot later on, because you will have all the friends that you need to sit in the right spot further on. And I think the time I spent in my first session just trying to figure out where that hierarchy was, because it was really clear when I got there, like how that's set up. That, in Nevada, you're limited to 6 sessions. And so I was there for 4 of my 6, but I would say my first 2 sessions, I'm still just trying to figure out how to make this whole, how to understand the machine and my spot in it in order to be able to really champion any bills. It wasn't until my 3rd session that I feel like I really knew the system and I knew how it worked. And I would actually use this to explain to constituents who would be, oh yeah, we need term limits. Term limits are great. And I would tell them, I said, I was in graduate school for like 10 years before I got my doctorate and became a professor. And I would say that the state is equally complex system to learn. And we only give people 6 terms. That's 12 years total. And so what happens with term limits is that you end up with this eternal churn of new people who never know the system. And your job, I always thought that my job was to fight the lobbyists for my constituents, but yet the lobbyists have been there for decades. And so just getting people to think about like how, like what a system this is, and that vertical hierarchy and the time that it takes. And I think that, you know, constituents get frustrated when you can't get things through for them, and you're still like just learning how things work. And if you put this against also, like, the governor is full-time in Nevada, got a full-time staff, a good size staff that's with them, you know, year round, and the legislature has none of that. So you're really at this big disadvantage and set into a hierarchy that doesn't allow you to fulfill the obligations and the desires of your constituents for at least a couple of terms for most people.
Yeah, fascinating. Gwen has been waiting for a while, and then I'll come to some questions in the chat in a minute. Gwen, would you like to ask your question? From University of Oxford.
Hi, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Can you see me?
Yes, we can, both. Go for it.
Yeah, great. Hi.
Breaking up
A
slightly.
graduate class here at the University of Oxford on, oh dear. Maybe I'll turn my video off. And, can you hear me okay now? Is that okay?
Actually, it's better now. Yeah, go for it. Let's try. Let's try. It's nice to see the group. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm here with a class of graduate students at the University of Oxford. We're studying anthropology of politics and the political. So we thought this was very pertinent for us to come and listen. Anthropologists who study the state often realize very quickly that it's very difficult, as Heidi was just saying, to get anything done at all from the inside. And I was just wondering if you could both share with us a story where you managed to get something that you're proud of done, or change something, or like one of those kind of moments of achievement where you think, yes, despite all of the difficulty, I managed to change this thing, and I'm really pleased that I managed to do that. It would be really nice to hear that. And I think we also have a question from Mark, who's going to come and take my place here.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, how does this body of anthropological knowledge that is accumulated during your experience in office, how can it be deployed to help any individual or group that is trying to make change, whether from inside these administrations or outside? How can we translate this knowledge into something more practical for people that are trying to make any kind of change? That's it.
Anyone else? All right.
2 for the price of 1. Fantastic. Thank you.
That's it.
Yeah, well, I'm going to add one more just to make your lives difficult, Heidi and Harini, because there's one in the chat which relates to that very question, or it's related. Bearing in mind the power that numbers have in policy making, with what type of knowledge and in what form do you consider anthropology can be heard and have an impact in policy making in a parliamentary context? So would either of you, like, you can be politician-like in the way you handle these questions, answer whichever ones you find most interesting.
Sure, I'd be happy.
Heidi, why don't you go first this time? Yeah.
So I'm trying to pick the thing that, so the one thing that I did that I think is that I'm most proud of was actually not, my bill didn't end up passing. I'm not sure how familiar you are all with payday loans and payday lending as an issue in the United States. These are relatively short-term, extremely high interest loans that tend to target people of color and low-income areas and put people in a really terrible debt spiral. So I took on the payday lenders, and it was over several sessions, about 3 sessions in which I ran various bills, both of which in the 2015 and the 2017 sessions died, that would have significantly curbed the payday lending field. But the interesting part of this was that this was all kind of a setup, in that it was to set up this huge, terrible bill that this liberal Heidi Swank brought to really clamp down on the payday lending industry. And it succeeded in really angering a lot of that industry. which for me wasn't a big problem. I didn't really care if they were mad at me. And then in one of the interims, there is a process called codification, in which bills are worked into the statutes. And you can do non-substantive reorganization of chapters at that time. So one thing that I did after the second session, in which I tried to do the payday lending bill, is I reorganized the payday lending chapter, and I separated out the different types of payday loans. There are 3 different types, into 3 separate chapters, which meant that you could regulate them individually, which was a divide and conquer type of approach, right? So suddenly you could write a bill for one of those chapters, where before you wrote it for the single chapter that brought every payday lender lobbyist after you. So suddenly you had a much smaller field to fight, and you could be more targeted. You could say, go after title loans or go after the full-on payday loans. And that would separate things, which just caused uproar, and people were extremely angry. And so then the next session, I brought my bill yet again. And then Senator Ivana Kinsella brought a bill that was much more modest. And that was the plan, is that her bill got through. I had made everyone so angry with me in payday lending that Ivana's bill appeared to be the reasonable bill, and the thing that, okay, if we can just get away from that swank bill, we can do the Kinsella bill, and we got done what we wanted to do. And it took 3 sessions, and it took coordination, and it's still not great in Nevada for payday lending, but it's better because of that. And I'd say that's one of the really good things I did. And I didn't get any credit for that because it was Ivana's bill. And that's fine, right? Because it still did the thing you wanted it to do. And then I will also say on the what are we doing to kind of further the anthropology work in what we're doing now. So one of the things I do at my current job is we have launched a policy institute, and that works on historic preservation policy and getting good thought out policy at the state, county, and local levels. And we're also working on starting a course to train historic preservationists, who are often anthropologists, in how to run for office, in order to get more historic preservationists in office, so that we can get some thoughtful policy with some really good folks spearheading that.
Great. Harini.
Yeah, something very trivial actually is that after I spoke about sanitary pads in Parliament, we actually got bins in all the women's toilets. So I was like, okay, at least I've got that done. The difference being in the Sri Lankan Parliament, being in the opposition, we don't get an opportunity to present bills, right? The bills are generally presented by the government side, and we, as the opposition, we don't do that unless it's a private member bill, which has very little success, right? Private member bills usually don't get taken up at all. But I think something that happened was the fact that one of the things that I think that happens is what you speak inside Parliament gets picked up outside, right? And I think that's where you can make some kind of impact on how things are talked about, or in highlighting issues. And I think one thing that I feel quite pleased about was the fact that I spoke about unpaid care work. And I've been speaking about unpaid care work quite a bit inside Parliament. And now there's like quite a good discussion about it outside, right? People are picking up on it, people are writing about it. And I feel, okay, that's where I actually felt that something I said in Parliament has had this kind of ripple effect, and it's getting picked up outside. So I think as a member of the opposition, it's the impact that you have outside of Parliament that gives you more satisfaction than what you can actually achieve inside, especially in the current Sri Lankan Parliament, where there's such an overwhelming majority from the government. In terms of answer, I think there was a question, Emma, about anthropology and policy making, right? And you know how as anthropologists, we look at context, we look at complexities, we look at, nothing is simple. You sort of, you're always looking for nuance, you're looking for subtlety, all of this, right? We tend to never see anything in simple terms, right? And it's both a real advantage as well as a disadvantage, because I can't see anything without in sort of black and white sort of terms, and in sort of the simple ways in which policies are usually presented. I immediately see what's left out. I immediately see what's unsaid, right? And so in a way that makes me, I think it makes me have a much more critical engagement with policy. But at the same time, I'm learning that critical perspective alone is not enough. You also figure out how to take that critical perspective and then translate into something that is actually doable and something that makes sense beyond a sort of an academic discussion, right? Something that can actually translate into something that is implementable or fundable, so it's not, you can't stop at saying it's complex, right? Or that it's something you need nuance here. Then, okay, so what do you do about it? So it forces you to take that next step also. So in some ways, I think that is something that anthropology can bring into politics, because usually it's seen in, I think the way we are trained to think about things, right, is really useful in this sort of otherwise sort of very sterile way of sort of compartmentalizing issues, or seeing things in isolation, or not seeing like the connections, or not seeing how things can impact people differently, right? But one thing that I learned really, really quickly was that you have to, it's not enough to say, well, it's complicated. And and that was something I loved doing as an anthropologist, as an academic, right? You sort of, that your analytical, your sort of frame of analysis is always to kind of look at what makes this thing more interesting. But I can't stop there now anymore.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I want to come back to that, but just in passing, I want to mention that there's some very interesting academic fellowships that have just been advertised by the Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology. So if there is an anthropologist who wants to go and spend a year in the UK Parliament working with select committees about how knowledge is used, or if they'd like to do it as a job share with me, because I don't feel like I've quite got the time to do it full time for a year. But if somebody wanted to do a job share, then that would be an amazing way to get anthropological knowledge taken more seriously, just getting into a lot of discussions with select committees about how knowledge is used within Parliament. But I want to stick with this kind of how you find out things and how that relates to the relationships that you have within Parliament and outside. So I want to relate it to a question that Cristiane Bernardes, who I know is from Brazil, because she's my colleague and I work with her, and she's a professor who specializes in parliaments, and she's asking what kind of resources, human or material, do you have in your respective, or did you have in your two places for doing tasks? Have Parliament or the parties provided some help? Please answer it however you want, but I guess I'm really interested, Heidi, how you managed a very complex constituency, but also interests that were rural. And so you've got this very urban constituency, with a lot, presumably, of mobility, people coming in and out. How did you represent them? How did you even find out about them? And who helped? So relating it to Christiane's question about who helped. And Harini, I guess you could relate it to all kinds of tasks, but one thing I'm very interested in is how you deal with the fact that you're in this tiny party. So some of the stuff you were talking about, I think you know, some of the finance demands on you become even more acute, surely, when you're in a party of 3 or a coalition of 3 people. So it gets even more difficult to say, oh, I think I'll pick this topic or that topic. You know, the smaller the party is, in a way, the more you're forced into areas where you don't necessarily feel you have specialist knowledge. So sorry to push my area. And Jonathan, if you want to pitch in at any time, just kind of wave at me if you would like to. Yeah, who would like to pick up on this question about how you find out stuff and who helps?
Okay, shall I go first, Heidi, and then, yeah? Okay, so yes, we do get resources from the Parliament. You're allowed to have 3 members of staff, but the policy in our coalition is that we use those 3 positions for the party as a whole, because the party organization also requires staff, right? And we use the positions that are allocated to our elected members for the party. So it's not as if I have 3 staff working for me. I have the 3 staff that are allocated for me work for the party, but I do have one person who works part-time for me as providing secretarial assistance, and another person who works part-time providing research assistance. Because there's lots of preparation that you have to do even when you want to speak, especially during like the budget debates where, every day there's a ministry that ministry account that is being debated. So you really need to prepare, you really need to have numbers, figures, and data at your fingertips, not just when you're in Parliament, but also when you then have to go out and speak to the media. So also the Sri Lankan Parliament has a research unit in the Parliament that is expected to support all the members. So any kind of information that I require from a particular department, government ministry, whatever, I can request the research unit to find that information for me. So there is support in terms of generating the kind of data that I require. And also there's a very, very good library, which also is, I can use for the preparation work. Yeah, what was, yeah, your other, sorry, Emma, your other question was about...
I think you addressed it, sort of how you acquire your knowledge, and particularly since you're in a small party.
Yeah, so just briefly, it's just that it does put more pressure on you because I don't know how it works elsewhere, but when a particular bill is debated in Parliament, each party gets allocated time to speak, right? And because it's the 3 of us, that means that almost every day one of us has to speak, right? And then the turnaround is quite quick, right? So every 3 days, I would have to speak almost. And also because even though we are only 3 people in Parliament, we have to be represented in every committee that's in Parliament, right? So that means we are in multiple committees, right? So there's a lot of committee work that each of us is also expected to do. So a Parliament day means you're also in the assembly, but you're also running around attending all these different committee meetings.
Yeah, thank you. Heidi.
So I find it interesting, Harini, that you have 3 staff from the state and they're kind of lent out to the caucus or to the party, right? So that's not actually allowed in Nevada. If they are funded, if it's a position funded by the state, they cannot have any contact with the caucus, with the assembly caucus and the party. Those are those staff for the caucus and for the Democratic Party in Nevada are raised separately as a 501c4. So those are all set up as separate entities with their own executive directors. And so when I was in office, I had one staffer during session, and they were nonpartisan staff. So which meant that all they did was scheduling and managing the office and making sure, like when I sat on Ways and Means, it's a lot more work to do all the budget work. And so there was a lot more work that she had to do. And so they were really not somebody who did research. We didn't have anyone to do research for us. The party didn't provide anyone, and the state didn't provide anyone. So we were kind of expected to do that, which means that a lot of folks rely on lobbyists and other advocacy groups to get their information. And so then we also did have a research division within the Legislative Council Bureau, which is all the staff behind the legislature. And those, again, were nonpartisan staff. They could do some nonpartisan work for you. They could bring you information. So but they couldn't help you, say, come up with the arguments for why your bill should be passed. They could just provide you with all that nonpartisan information that you then had to process on your own. So you would do a lot of that work on your own. It was helpful, as I said, I hired a person to work, like she worked like 5 hours a week for me. And even during the legislative session, she didn't come to Carson City with me. She stayed in Las Vegas and did constituent support, but she did my bill presentations for me. So she would do research, but that I paid for from my own campaign funds. There's very little support in Nevada for legislators to get that kind of research. You learn it all on your own. It's your cell phone people call. It's a very small town, but it's also a pretty small state. As far as getting to Emma's question about having kind of two constituencies, so the area that I represented was very liberal leaning and very interested in environmental issues. And it was partly because of that, but also when I got to the legislature, I was figuring out my path to move up and to try to get a chair, chairing something. It became really clear to me that I was not on the trajectory to go to, to run for the US Senate. I was not on that trajectory. I think I was too far left for any of that. And so I had to find my path. And so I looked at the Natural Resources Committee and knew that that was always a committee that the chair would kind of cycle through, be a second session Democrat would chair Natural Resources, and then they would move up to something else. So I pitched that I would stay at Natural Resources and I would not leave, and you would have consistency in a chair in that committee. And then through that, I started learning a lot more about rural issues. A lot of the things that come through Natural Resources are rural. And then my day job running the historic preservation nonprofit did a lot of work in rural Nevada too. So then I would find myself during those interims out in rural Nevada and was able to kind of do a twofer because they knew that the assemblywoman was with me and I was there as Nevada Preservation, but also that then I could talk to somebody and have constituent meetings in these rural areas. And also just a lot of those interests kind of overlapped because I chaired Natural Resources, Public Lands, the Wildfire Committee. I ended up just being able to kind of craft a space for myself that allowed me to do a lot of that. I will say too that one of the things I would change about the district that I represented is that it had such low voter turnout. It is 40% Hispanic, and not a lot of folks turn out to vote. I always said if I got voted out of office because suddenly my Hispanic constituency voted and they voted for someone who was Hispanic, that would be a success. It wasn't a district where people kind of held me accountable. People didn't feel they could engage. They didn't really feel like they were part of the system. And so I really felt like my job was to go out and figure out what they needed without them having to tell me, because they weren't going to tell me, and then to go represent that in the legislature. So it was a very unusual kind of district in that there just was so little voter engagement. And it was very different than most of the other districts in the Nevada legislature where people were very involved.
Fascinating. I mean, I just think we don't know that much about how different politicians in different countries do that process of going out and finding out what people are thinking about, what they wish for, what they, you know, what their visions are for the future, you know, all that kind of stuff, that we know quite a lot about the way government claims to be doing it, and sometimes parliaments and sometimes select committees and whatever. But individual politicians in their constituencies with their staff and their local party office and whatever, we don't know that much about, and I know they all do it very, very differently. I just know about certain politicians, but it's you know, the more I go and have a look, the more I realize it's very different.
I'll say that I really got into taking on the payday lending industry because I got a campaign contribution from a constituent for like, I don't know, it was like $50. And it said in the memo line, fight payday lenders. And I'm like, okay, I have a message here. Let's run with that. And I started to look into it, and I realized like my district had one of the highest concentrations of payday loans storefronts in the Las Vegas Valley. It way outnumbered banks. They presented themselves as the default lending option. And it became really clear once I like found the research that was being done that this was a really important concern for my constituents. And it came from that memo line on that little contribution to my campaign.
You've been incredibly generous, both of you, talking about yourself, your own experience. There's a question in the chat, which of course I would not relate to you, because it's about scurrilous behavior and eating too much and drinking too much. So now's your chance to talk about other politicians. So the question goes like this: the demand, a political scientist or maybe a political psychologist has floated a theory. The demands of the public are so relentless that politicians respond by eating and drinking too much, and then it progresses to accepting favors, and then regressively to outright bribes. Is this a valid explanation? Was it ever? This is from Emil. And I wanted to maybe add, you know, if any, I mean, you can't answer this question necessarily, Heidi or Harini, but I do think it's interesting to try and ask, why is it that we have got what I identify at least as a magnification of scurrilous behavior in the UK, which is an extraordinary casual attitude towards, for example, telling the truth as far as one can. It's difficult as a politician, it's a team sport, you have to spin, but there is a casual attitude towards all sorts of things, truth-telling, the institution of parliament, rules, laws, that has emerged in recent years, and trying to get beyond just kind of blaming one individual, which feels very inadequate. How can we be sociological in trying to understand the bad behavior of other politicians?
I can start that since I'm not in office anymore. It's probably an easier question for me. And so one of the things that I found really interesting is this idea of the bubble, and like the bubble that you step into and the way in which you are treated. And so like, I remember like this very strange thing on Facebook, like after I got elected, my Facebook stayed pretty much locked down to just my friends, but every post I made got so many more likes. Like it was so much more popular. Like my jokes were always funny. And I think that like, this is kind of the bubble into which you step. Like it's been very hard to step into, like to step out of that and realize that I don't get to talk as much as I want to. I don't get, you know, any turn I want for as long as I want. Like I don't have that anymore. And to even like realize that that's happening to you when you step into that elected bubble, in the ways in which you are so treated so preferentially. And I think that is where the bad behavior comes out, because you have folks who get elected. And like for me, I always talked about the assemblywoman as my alter ego. Like she wasn't actually me, because it never was terribly comfortable to say that she was me. And I think that was helped me to kind of keep the two roles separate. But I also saw in some folks, and I will say for the most part in Nevada at least, people negotiate this pretty well because it's a lot to try to figure out. But you do have the cases where people really see that elected position as them. Like, this is all I am and this is all I have. And then so if you feel like that is really you, the way that you're being treated, and then you can, I've seen it in, having dealt with, a few sexual harassers in that we ousted in Nevada, that they feel like they're doing you a favor to include you in their private life. So I think that there's this idea that, I am such a special person because I've been so built up in this bubble and I haven't really thought about that. Maybe that's not true. And then that it's really like, I'm going to send you this little private text message from the dais, and it's like our little thing. And, we're going to have this flirty banter back and forth that really is probably crossing a line, but it's a favor because I'm including you. And I would say that doesn't happen with a lot of people in Nevada, but there were definitely folks, I can come up with a good list right there, at the top of my head, of folks who did cross that line, because that bubble is just, it's so attractive, it is so comfortable, and it's lovely to always be the center of attention and be treated like the knowledgeable one. And so I think it comes more out of that kind of conditioning of how you're treated and not taking a critical look at what that actually means.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Harini, would you like to answer that, or would you like a different question?
No, I just want to say I completely agree. And it's something that I'm very conscious of, the need to have the sort of support systems that make sure you don't remain in the bubble all the time, because it's so easy to get sucked into that. And I can see that in some of my colleagues who've been in this for a really long time, that they know no other life. They do not know any other way of being, any other way of relating to people. Right? And especially if they come from sort of dynastic type political families where everybody else is also like this, right? So for me, it's been really, really important to have non-political people, or, I don't know, another life, as it were, that I consciously try to keep separate from this bubble. I completely agree with Heidi that that's what facilitates or produces all this bad behavior.
Yeah, fascinating. Right, we've got one more question in the chat, unless you've got any comments or questions, Jonathan. I'll just tell you this question and then see if there's any final comments or questions. So this is a question from Jazz Kaur from SOAS. Could you say something about the issues of researcher access, as well as the ethical complications of studying parliaments in fragile places, where the state and politicians are not inclined to be open and transparent? Or more generally, what is your advice to anthropologists venturing in to study parliaments?
I think that's a question best answered by our chair.
Yeah.
Make friends. Not always easy. Yeah, did you want to add anything else, Jonathan, before I give Heidi and Harini a chance to say?
No, I've got one departing line, but I'll leave that till we depart.
Okay, fine, good. Yes, Harini or Heidi, do you have any advice about getting in there as an anthropologist, or getting in there maybe as a citizen? We could say, we could add. Final
yeah, thought. It's weird because there's so much of what we do is in the public eye, right? Everything we do is done in the public eye. All our, everything is on television, it's on social media, so it's there for everyone to see and observe. There's no sort of restriction. But at the same time, and I don't really know, but there's so much of it is so performative also for that very reason, that I think it would, whether you can ever sort of, I think it's like the classic fieldwork conundrum. Can you ever get to the truth? Because, there's your inner situation where your very presence then changes the dynamics, and whether you can actually ever get a politician to come out of that performative role is something I don't know. I mean, even if someone were to ask me questions, I'm very conscious of how I would answer questions from even a journalist now, right? Because you're very conscious of the fact that of how things can be interpreted, and also that you are no longer just able to speak on behalf of yourself. You're representing a party. You're representing a group. You're responsible for that, right? So you can never be completely free and open in what you say and just relax and say anything, right? So I don't know how you would break through that cover that I think we are all compelled to kind of put on in public.
And I would agree. I would say that, like, so one of the things in my experience in Nevada is the caucuses. So each party in each house has a caucus: Assembly, Senate, Democrats, Republicans, so 4 caucuses. And we would spend a lot of time in our caucus room. And that's where dissent, like that's where an anthropologist needs to be, is you need to find access to that caucus room in order to, because we would be in there and we would be yelling at each other and disagreeing, and we would spend hours there because we were a really well-led caucus, in that was what that space was for dissent. And that we all came to the agreement, which might have been chaotic and not everybody's super happy about it, but we all kind of found where we would be, and we walked out that door, and that any difference was gone. Like, we were tight. And I will say that was one of the most amazing things of my experience there, is to see that back end of things, because that's where your performance goes away. And so if you really want to be an anthropologist to kind of understand how this process works, is you've got to get into the caucuses, at least in the United States, in order to see like how people really fulfill this role. Because that performative piece, that once you're outside that caucus room, you're not going to get much of anything.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I knew that a politician was beginning to trust me if they started to be very, very rude about their own side. Because of course you can be rude about the other side.
Yeah.
That's no secret. But the divisions within party, that's delicate. And and that's why, as you say, you've got to get in there, but it's really hard. Can I give the last word to you, Jonathan? If you've got anything to say finally, before
I'll struggle to get this out in as clear and unsentimental a way as possible. I mean, I've always been slightly suspicious of the magic bullet theory of anthropology, that, you know, any aspect of life would be better if we simply get an anthropologist to do it. There are reasons why I don't have anthropologists, I don't know, fixing my washing machine or, you know, rewiring my house. But nevertheless, you know, I sit and think in, you know, a case like this, what is it about these two remarkable people that we've been listening to this afternoon, you know, as well as a suspicion of the magic bullet theory of anthropology, I'm also even more suspicious of the perfect cloning theory of teaching, that, you know, your job as a teacher is to produce people who think like you and do things like you. So, I mean, what I say is more obviously grounded when I talk about Harini, but I think this is true of both of our speakers. I'm kind of awestruck. This goes back to the should we feel sorry for them? I'm actually awestruck by the things that people like Harini and Heidi go out and do in the world that I couldn't imagine myself being able to do. You know, and I said, you know, the anxiety dreams of waking up and finding yourself on the stage and suddenly having to sing in an opera. Just imagine the anxiety dream of waking up and realizing that, you know, you are I don't know, Keir Starmer, and you've got this blubber mountain opposite you calling you names in the House of Commons. And, you know, my inclination would be to just run away if that were happening. And the capacity to not merely to move into these areas, but to actually achieve things in these areas, and the humility to recognize the degree of skill it takes, something that Harini was talking about, just amazes me. So, you know, to get back to, you know, as a teacher, what's always wonderful is when people do things that you can't do. They go beyond anything that you could do. But as an anthropologist, I sit back and think, okay, so what was it about the anthropology that made that possible? And I'm still thinking that in both these cases. But I am just so impressed by what it is that they do. And wish, if anybody out there in the 40 people who are still with us feels like following them, then I would heartily encourage you to do that.
That's an absolutely fabulous note to end on. Can I just thank you, Jonathan, but especially Heidi and Harini for coming and giving us the most precious thing, which is time, but also amazing reflections on your experience. A really fabulous conversation. Thank you so much, and look forward to more conversations in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.